From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
10 years ago tonight, President Bush ordered the invasion of Iraq. The war killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and devastated a nation. We'll speak with Nita Crawford of the Cost of War Project and Iraqi-American blogger Raed Jarrar.
The situation in Iraq is extremely bad. It's very bad. The services that the Iraqi public are receiving are dysfunctional. People don't have access to very basic services like water, electricity, sewage, education, and healthcare. The political situation is deteriorating. It's very bad.
And as President Obama heads to the Middle East for his first trip to Israel as president, we'll speak with Columbia University professor Rashid Khalidi, author of the new book, Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East.
There's no mention in his speeches of Palestinian suffering. There's no mention in his speeches of the fact that he's facing an Israeli government that has steadfastly refused to budge an inch in terms of issues that presidents going back to Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr. have tried to push Israel on, settlements and so on and so forth. The president backed down after his first 2 years in office on all of these issues.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A series of bomb blasts have ripped through Baghdad and surrounding towns on the 10th anniversary of the U.S.-led invasion that began a decade-long war in Iraq. At least 56 people died in more than a dozen explosions, most of them car bombings. It was 10 years ago today the United States under President George W. Bush invaded Iraq on the false pretext that Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction. Now, a decade after the invasion began, a new poll confirms most people in the U.S. believe it was a mistake. We'll have more on the war and its legacy after headlines. A Congolese rebel leader wanted on war crimes charges has turned himself into the U.S. Embassy in Rwanda and asked to be transferred to the International Criminal Court. Bosco Ntaganda was a leader of the M23 rebel group that temporarily seized the Congolese city of Goma last year. He has been indicted by the ICC for murder, rape, sexual slavery, ethnic persecution, and recruiting child soldiers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Ntaganda had reportedly been fleeing from a rival faction of the M23 rebel movement. Some have also speculated he may have lost backing from supporters in Rwanda. Syrian aircraft have fired rockets into Lebanon along a remote area of the border. The attacks come after the Syrian government warned Lebanon to stop militants crossing the border to join rebels fighting President Bashar al-Assad. U.S. State Department spokesperson Victoria Nuland condemned the Syrian strikes.
Let me say that we can confirm what you are seeing in the press, that regime jets and helicopters did fire rockets into northern Lebanon, impacting Wadi al-Qayyeh near the border town of Arsal. This constitutes a significant escalation in the violations of Lebanese sovereignty that the Syrian regime has been guilty of. These kinds of violations of sovereignty are absolutely unacceptable.
The Syrian National Council has elected a Syrian-born U.S. citizen to serve as prime minister of an interim government overseeing areas captured by rebels. Hassan Hito is a technology executive who's lived in the U.S. for more than 20 years. His election follows pressure from the United States and other countries for Syria's opposition to choose a leader as a condition of increasing aid. It remains to be seen to what extent Syria's divided rebel groups will accept Hito's authority. In Somalia, a suicide car bomber killed at least 10 people in the capital, Mogadishu. The militant group al-Shabaab has claimed responsibility. The blast appeared to target a group of government officials, but instead hit a vehicle carrying civilians. Yemen's launched a national dialogue to usher in elections and a new constitution after the popular uprising that forced President Ali Abdullah Saleh from power. A number of groups are protesting the UN-backed talks, including some who want independence from South Yemen. At least one protester was reportedly shot dead during protests in the southeastern city of Tarim. Nobel laureate Tawakkol Karman told AFP she's boycotting the talks over the, quote, obvious imbalance in the representation of the youths, women, and civil society groups in the participation of people who have the blood of the revolution youth on their hands, she said. For a full interview with Tawakkol Karman after it was announced she would win the Nobel Peace Prize, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. Representatives from roughly 150 countries are meeting in New York in a bid to negotiate the world's first-ever global arms treaty. The treaty's fate could rest largely on the United States, which leads the world in global arms exports. The U.S. backed out of last year's talks, along with Russia and China, saying it wanted more time. The National Rifle Association has thrown its weight against a potential treaty, vowing to block its ratification in the U.S. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called for a deal on Monday.
This is no doubt a difficult issue. Yet, the absence of the rule of law in the conventional arms trade defies explanation. We have international standards regulating everything from T-shirts to toys to tomatoes. There are international regulations for furniture. That means there are common standards for the global trade in armchairs, but not the global trade in arms.
The UN talks come as a new study has revealed about 2% of all U.S. gun sales are made to groups that smuggle them into Mexico. More than 250,000 U.S. guns head into Mexico each year as a part of an illegal trade worth nearly $130 million annually, this according to researchers at the University of San Diego. In fact, thousands of U.S. sellers depend on the illegal sales and would go out of business without them, the report found. A trial challenging the New York City Police Department's controversial stop-and-frisk policy opened Monday with testimony from young African-American men who say they've been stopped and searched without cause. For the next 6 weeks, Judge Shira Shinlin will hear arguments about whether the NYPD's practices are unconstitutional and unfairly target people of color. Nearly 90% of people stopped by police in 2011 were black and Latino, and 9 out of 10 were neither arrested nor ticketed. Plaintiffs in the class action suit are seeking changes to police practices, including a court-appointed monitor. Juan Cartagena, president of Latino Justice, spoke at a news conference outside the courthouse.
Philadelphia is watching. Newark is watching us. Patterson, New Orleans, Chicago. Los Angeles, San Francisco. That's because policing in urban America is on trial. Policing in urban America is at issue. Policing and how black and brown people are treated is on trial. Do not forget that what's happening in New York City by the NYPD is being watched closely by other police departments all over the country.
President Obama has nominated Tom Perez, now head of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, to become the new Secretary of Labor. Perez was an advisor to the late Senator Ted Kennedy and oversaw Maryland's Department of Labor, where he helped implement the country's first statewide living wage law. During his tenure at the Justice Department, he opened a record number of investigations into civil rights abuses by local police, including a racial profiling suit against Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio. But his nomination comes on the heels of an Inspector General's report that accused the department's voting rights unit of partisan divisions and unprofessionalism. President Obama praised Perez on Monday.
Like so many Americans, Tom knows what it's like to climb the ladder of opportunity. He's the son of Dominican immigrants. He helped pay his way through college as a garbage collector and working at a warehouse. In his current role as the head of the U.S. Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, Tom's fought to open pathways into the workforce for everyone willing to contribute, including people with disabilities, LGBT Americans, and immigrants. And he's helped settle some of the largest cases ever on behalf of families targeted by unfair mortgage lending.
Perez faces opposition from Republicans who object to his record on voting rights in support of undocumented immigrants. He's the only Latino to be tapped for Obama's second-term cabinet. Perez began his remarks Monday by thanking President Obama in Spanish.
Le agradezco, señor presidente, el gran honor de ser nominado para servir en esta posición. It is a remarkably humbling and exciting phenomenon to be here today. My parents taught my 4 siblings and me to work hard, to give back to our community, and to make sure that the ladder of opportunity was there for those coming after us. Over my career, I've learned that true progress is possible if you keep an open mind, listen to all sides, and focus on results.
A hacker who leaked email addresses from an AT&T web server to a journalist in an effort to expose the company's security vulnerabilities has been sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. 27-year-old Andrew Auernheimer, nicknamed Weave, found a flaw in AT&T's server in 2010 that allowed him to gather 114,000 email addresses of iPad users. He gave the information to the website Gawker, which posted a redacted version. After a federal probe, Auernheimer was convicted of identity theft and conspiracy to access a computer without authorization. On top of the prison term, he's been ordered to undergo 3 years of supervised release and pay more than $73,000 in restitution to AT&T. He was charged under the controversial Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the same law used by federal prosecutors to target the late cyber activist Aaron Swartz, who committed suicide in January, just weeks before his trial for downloading a trove of academic articles. Last week, Reuters social media editor Matthew Keyes was indicted under the same law. Matthew Keyes is accused of providing login information to the hacker group Anonymous that allowed them to alter the text of a headline on the website of the Los Angeles Times. Keyes, who is 26 years old, could face up to 25 years in prison. 2 teenage girls in Steubenville, Ohio, have been arrested for making threats on social media against a 16-year-old rape victim, whose case sparked a national outcry and led to the conviction of 2 high school football players. The girls, aged 15 and 16, were being held in juvenile detention after one threatened the girl with bodily harm and the other threatened to kill the victim. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Aaron Matte. Welcome to our listeners and viewers. Well, it was 10 years ago today that the U.S. invaded Iraq on the false pretext that Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction. The attack came despite worldwide protest and a lack of authorization from the UN Security Council. This was how Democracy Now! Began our broadcast on March 19th, 2003.
U.S. and British forces have moved into the demilitarized zone straddling the Iraq-Kuwait border in preparation for an attack on Iraq. Reuters is reporting convoys of U.S. and British tanks and fighting vehicles have been snaking through sandstorms in the Kuwaiti desert heading towards the Iraqi border. One Iraqi has already been shot dead off the coast of Kuwait. Less than 12 hours remain before the U.S. ultimatum to the Iraqi president, Saddam Hussein, to flee reaches its deadline at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. Baghdad has rejected it. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has proposed for the first time that President Saddam Hussein should go into exile as a last-ditch bid to avert war.
Well, later that evening, a Pentagon official reported cruise missiles had been fired in Iraq as part of a, quote, decapitation attack aimed at killing Saddam Hussein. Then, around 5:30 a.m. Baghdad time, 9:30 p.m. Eastern time, air raid sirens were heard after the U.S. deadline for Saddam to step down had passed. Within the hour, President George W. Bush gave a nationally televised speech from the Oval Office, announcing the war had begun.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
6 weeks later, President Bush would stand under a banner reading "Mission Accomplished" and declared an end to major military combat operations in Iraq. But Operation Iraqi Freedom, as he called it, would lead to an almost 9-year U.S. military occupation of Iraq. We begin the show today looking at the costs of war. That's the title of a massive new report by a team of 30 economists, anthropologists, political scientists, legal experts, and physicians about the Iraq War's impact. In one of its striking tallies, it found the total number number of people who've died from the Iraq War, including soldiers, militants, police, contractors, journalists, humanitarian workers, and civilians, has reached at least 189,000 people, including at least 123,000 civilians. The report also looks at the ballooning expenses of veterans' benefits and medical treatment. For more, we're joined by its co-author, Anita Crawford, co-director of the Cost of War Project, professor of political science at Boston University, where she's joining us from now. Professor Crawford, welcome to Democracy Now! Lay out the costs of the Iraq War.
The costs, I think, can be put into basically three baskets. The first is the short-term budgetary costs. Second are the immediate human toll, which you've just mentioned, about 190,000 people killed, and then there are many wounded. And then there's the long-term economic consequences. If just think about the budgetary costs, the Bush administration told us that the war would be maybe $50–60 billion. And the person, Lawrence Lindsay, who gave a higher estimate of $100 to $200 billion, was told to find other work. So what we see now is the cost of the Iraq War is $1.7 trillion so far. And into the future, more like $2.1 trillion, including those long-term benefits for veterans care. So that's in the one basket. And in the second basket, the human toll, that 130,000 or so civilians actually is probably an undercount, maybe by a factor of 2, because what's recorded is what Iraq Body Count notes. They keep a tally of press reports and official releases of civilian casualties, but we know that the Iraqi Ministry of Health and the morgues have been told not to release all the war's dead. And then many people are wounded, of course. The wounded are probably in a 1-to-1, at least a 1-to-1 ratio in Iraq, so 130,000 or maybe many more than that seriously wounded. And then if you think about the long-term costs, we can get into that, but they're substantial as well.
And, Professor, the ways in which people have died, obviously you have people being killed through bombings, direct warfare, but you also talk about the indirect toll through the health crisis in Iraq.
Right. The indirect deaths, or excess death, as some demographers call it, are caused when infrastructure is destroyed, either intentionally or unintentionally. So when bombing takes out water treatment facilities, or sanctions before the war did not allow the repair of material that was vital for health, like the healthcare infrastructure, and then that's exacerbated with the war. What you see is that immunization rates go down, infant mortality goes up. You see diseases and injuries which could have been taken care of medically inside Iraq, not taken care of. Now, many Iraqis have tried to seek treatment in the region, in Syria. They've had to leave Syria now. Jordan, Lebanon, they've even as far away as India, but getting treatment is difficult and expensive as well. So there's a huge healthcare crisis there. Many doctors have left not to return. So right now in Iraq there are 22,000 physicians for a population of over 31 million. There are 84 psychiatrists for that same population, a population that is traumatized by many years of war, and before that by sanctions and another war.
Then there's the U.S. soldiers, the U.S. soldiers who went there, the thousands who were killed, and the soldiers who come back wounded. Can you talk first about the deaths of U.S. soldiers and also those who came back physically ill, for example, respiratory illnesses, almost like we saw in the Gulf War?
Well, the illnesses for the well, let's just first begin with the deaths of U.S. soldiers. 4,488 soldiers died in the Iraq War. That is, of all kinds of causes, IEDs, which we're familiar with, but also being crushed by their own vehicles, in traffic accidents. They died in the many ways that people die in war, shot, and so on. Many come back wounded, complex injuries, more complex than in previous wars because of the higher survival rates in the field. And what you also see, which you've just mentioned, are chronic respiratory problems. So there's something called constrictive bronchiolitis, which is a disease caused by small particles, 2.5 to 10 microns, embedded inside the lungs of these returning soldiers, and that's caused by dust and burn pits. So this particulate matter gets inside the soldiers' lungs, and it decreases their ability to exercise. They're no longer elite athletes as they were when they deployed. Now they're having difficulty running a mile or two. And these soldiers also come back with higher rates of heart problems, and more than a third of them who have become subject to the Veteran Administration's care are seeking help for mental disturbances.
Which brings us to suicide. In August, we spoke to Iraq War veteran Aaron Hughes about suicides in the military.
Every day in this country, 18 veterans are committing suicide. 17% of the individuals that are in combat in Afghanistan, my brothers and sisters, are on psychotropic medication. 20 to 50% of the individuals that are getting deployed to Afghanistan are already diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, military sexual trauma, or a traumatic brain injury. Currently, 1/3 of the women in the military are sexually assaulted. It's clear that these policies of the global war on terror has had a profound effect on the military and my brothers and sisters, while simultaneously perpetuating a failed policy. And unfortunately, we have to live with that failed policy on a daily basis, and we don't want to be a part of that failed policy anymore.
Iraq War veteran Aaron Hughes talking about suicides in the military, this emotional cost, the deaths that relate to suicide in this country from soldiers returning, veterans, and also the costs of veteran care. Professor Crawford.
Well, 349 active duty soldiers committed suicide last year. And then there are the veterans who have tried to take their life and not succeeded, and then the many who succeed.
Soldiers, active duty soldiers, that's more than a soldier a day, just active duty. That doesn't count veterans. Every day,
300,
close to
349.
Close to.
Yes, almost a soldier a day. That's right. And these active duty soldiers are lucky. They have available to them the resources of the Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Navy, trying to help them not commit suicide. And unfortunately, those efforts are not bearing fruit. That's a higher suicide rate than the year before, and a higher suicide number than the year before that. So what we see is that despite the resources that are being put into helping the soldiers who return from Iraq and Afghanistan, it's not bearing enough fruit. And then what you'll also see is for the veterans, it's possible that the number of suicides will increase over time because trauma is cumulative. There's a study in World War I that found that if you had somebody out in the field long enough, everyone would return with what they then called shell shock, or now post-traumatic stress. So everyone is vulnerable, and so the resources that you need to put there are tremendous.
Hey, Professor, overall, your report cites a figure of $2.2 trillion as the cost to U.S. taxpayers for the Iraq War. But you actually say that the cost could be higher because so much of that funding was borrowed, so there'll be more money to pay because of interest.
That's right. It's like buying a house, and in this case, we bought a house that never really functioned, and we have repair costs. But just talk about the interest on our mortgaged war. It will be several $1 trillion over time. Now, the United States has many policy options available to deal with the interest on borrowing for the war, which could reduce the several trillion. But the trillions that the United States will pay in interest if we don't, for instance, engage in a war tax will exceed the cost of the war.
What most surprised you, Professor Crawford, about the costs of war report?
Well, there are so many things we weren't able to include. for example, we didn't look at the cost to the Allies. The UK and Germany have spent $20 billion apiece, probably, but they don't know themselves, on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with the United States. So the U.S. has sort of been subsidized by its allies. So we didn't include some of these larger costs. And, of course, we weren't able to get to some of the costs in the region. So what struck me was how much we don't know yet about the cost. The second thing that always strikes me is the sort of indifference to life that one sees, both the life in Iraq, how we don't know exactly how many people have died in Iraq, and how we still don't know and haven't put the resources in to repair, so to decrease the indirect deaths that will follow over the years from this war. Just an indifference, or maybe perhaps a lack of understanding of the consequences of war. And as always, yes, go ahead.
You talk about the cost of war. What about who profited?
Well, some corporations made out pretty well. Lockheed, the ones we heard about during the war, they did very well. Contractors, the human contractors themselves, though, were wounded and killed at high rates. So if you worked for one of the contractors, then you might feel that your salary didn't compensate for the stress that you're under. You don't get the same benefits that U.S. soldiers got, but the companies themselves made handsome profits, yes.
Nita Crawford, I want to thank you for being with us, co-director of the Cost of War Project, professor of political science at Boston University. We will link to their report at our website, along with our timeline highlighting a decade of Iraq War coverage on Democracy Now! You can visit our website at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Raed Jarrar joins us, Iraqi American, about where he was 10 years ago and where his country is today. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate.
As we continue our look at the 10th anniversary of the Iraq invasion, we're joined now by Raed Jarrar, an Iraqi-American blogger and political analyst. He led the first civilian casualty survey in Iraq as the country director of Civic Worldwide. He has closely monitored the issue of civilian casualties, as well as the larger fallout from the U.S. invasion for the last 10 years. He is presently communications director at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. Raed, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you tell us where were you 10 years ago today?
I was in Baghdad. I was living in Jordan at the time, finishing my master's degree. But I went back to Baghdad in February of 2003 to be with my family during the invasion. Everyone knew that the invasion will happen and that the Iraqi government will fall. So I went to help prepare for the U.S.-led invasion. I was helping dig a well in our backyard to get drinking water and store some fuel for electricity and some food. So this is what everyone was doing at those days. And I remember waking up on the 19th with the noises of sirens and explosions in the early morning. I remember that very clearly. And the rest of my family got up and we had breakfast, and we knew that it has started, it has begun.
Can you talk about what's happened in this 10 years? Talk about the casualties. Talk about what's happened to your family. What everyone says, this hopeless Sunni-Shia divide. Your own family being not one, not the other, but all.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to describe in words. When I think of where we used to live 10 years ago and what is going on now, it's like two different lives. 10 years ago, we lived within half an hour from all of my relatives from both sides, my mother's side and my father's side. My uncles, my cousins, my aunts, we all lived, in Baghdad. Now, I don't know a single person in the entire country. I don't know a single person in Iraq. When I go for a visit, I can't visit anyone because all of my relatives and friends and colleagues and the neighbors, they were either killed or they left the country to somewhere else. My immediate family now lives all the way from the west coast of the U.S. and Canada until New Zealand. We're literally all around the world. A family that was within half an hour away from each other now are all around the world. The toll on our family, of course, was we're among the luckier ones because we didn't lose immediate family members. But of course, we lost everything. We lost our house. We lost, we lost our country, and we moved on, and now we have new lives.
And Red, on the issue of sectarian conflict, you've written about how before the invasion, the issue of being a Sunni or a Shia was not one that was even familiar to you. But now, of course, when we think about Iraq, that seems to be the defining issue, the sectarian conflict.
Correct. I mean, I mentioned previously how I'm half Sunni and half Shiite. Many Iraqis jokingly now refer to people like myself as sushis. And, it's like getting our community is getting smaller and smaller because there are less mixed marriages. Before 2003, I did not know who from my friends were Sunnis or Shiites, and we've never expressed any concerns. We've never heard any stories about this person being a Sunni or a Shiite. Not only from a personal experience, the example that I always give is the 55 deck of cards that was printed by the Pentagon and CIA when they went after the top 55 leaders in Iraq. 36 out of those 55 were Shiites. It's almost the same representation publicly. I mean, not to say that the former Iraqi government was all-inclusive and everyone was happy, but it was a dictatorship that was secular. So people's ethnic and sectarian affiliations were not really a part of that oppression. If you supported the government, you had a good life, and if you opposed it, regardless of your sectarian affiliation, you were destroyed, and your entire family was destroyed. Unfortunately, these things changed completely now. They changed because of two reasons. The first one is the complete destruction of the Iraqi national identity. There is no civic identity in Iraq anymore. So people regressed. They went to the other level that they can identify with, and that unfortunately was the sectarian affiliation. The second reason is that this is actually the system that was introduced by the United States in 2003. The governing council that was created by the U.S. in 2003 marks the first occasion where Iraqis were chosen to run the country based on their sectarian and ethnic affiliations in Iraq's contemporary history. It never happened before the U.S. came.
I want to turn to former President George W. Bush. In 2010, in his first major interview since leaving office, Bush spoke to NBC's Matt Lauer about the Iraq War.
So by the time you gave the order to start military operations in Iraq, did you personally have any doubt, any shred of doubt about that intelligence?
No, I didn't. I really didn't.
Not everybody thought you should go to war, though. There were dissenters.
Of course there were.
Did you filter them out?
I was a dissenting voice. I didn't want to use force.
Your words. No one was more sickened or angry than I was when we didn't find weapons of mass destruction. You still have a sickening feeling.
I do.
When you think about it.
I do.
Was there ever any consideration of apologizing to the American people?
I mean, apologizing would basically say the decision was a wrong decision, and I don't believe it was a wrong decision.
If you knew then what you know now,
that's right,
you would still go to war in Iraq.
I first of all didn't have that luxury. You just don't have the luxury when you're president. I will say, definitely, the world is better off without Saddam Hussein in power, as are 25 million people who now have a chance to live in freedom.
That was Matt Lauer interviewing President George W. Bush in 2010. He didn't follow up that question by asking, would you apologize to the Iraqi people? But Riyad Jarrar, can you talk about Bush's response and what that apology should look like?
I don't think we should be asking President Bush if he should apologize or if what happened was criminal and immoral. I think there should be an independent investigation in the United States to hold those who took the U.S. to war accountable, including President Bush and other politicians in his administration. The crimes that were committed and the fraud and the money that was spent and the lives that were destroyed deserve an apology and a compensation, and they deserve everyone who was behind these attacks to be held accountable. I think the vast majority of Iraqis expect to get an apology. They expect to get compensation for what happened to their country in the last 2 decades. The country has been destroyed, and the people who were killed in Iraq were compensated by $2,500, believe it or not. The U.S. government has a policy of compensating Iraqis by giving them $2,500 for any family member who is killed, and $2,500, the same amount, for any property that is damaged. I mean, just see how humiliating it is to come to a family that lost their car and 2 of their kids and give them $7,500, because this is our policy. We give them $2,500 a piece, whether that piece is a human being or a car. I mean, imagine the level of humiliation, the level of disregard to human life in Iraq. All of these things have to change. I mean, it's true that the U.S. has ended its military occupation to Iraq, but the U.S. moral and legal obligations to the country are not over yet.
Final question about casualties. What do you believe is the total in Iraq?
Yeah, it's not really about what I believe. I just want to explain a discrepancy between the 2 numbers that we hear thrown around all the time. One of them is the documented number. Like the previous guest explained, this is a number that is based on how many Iraqi casualties were reported in English-speaking media. You see, like, this is like a small portion of the full number of casualties. Now, there are other studies that, based on sampling, try to reach to the full estimated number. So we have 2 different layers of numbering. One of them is the full documented number, and the other is the full estimated number. And the factor between them, through all the different studies that took place in the last 10 years, is around 10. If we saw the factor, for example, between the Lancet study, or the 2 Lancet studies that were conducted by Johns Hopkins, at the time that the Lancet study found the number to be around, the full estimated to be around 655,000, Iraq body count was around 65,000 of documented numbers. There is a factor of 10. So now I think the agreed upon number among many of the observers of Iraqi casualties is that the documented number is around 120,000, but then the full estimated number is somewhere in the area of 1.2 million. And the discrepancy between the 2 numbers is usually confusing, but I think once people know why we have these 2 numbers, it becomes easier to understand the full picture.
Raed Jarrar, I want to thank you for being with us. Iraqi-American blogger, political analyst, communications director at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, joining us from Washington. When we come back, President Obama is making his first trip to Israel. We'll speak with Columbia University Professor Rashid Khalidi. Stay with us.
من زمان برتوي منها زي سارق بس بالاحلام بشوفها مر الحقيقه ضايق اتجمعوا علي حتى العربي متآمر روحي عكفي فيها ارض بقلبي كنت مهاجر تاريخي مشرد تاريخي لاجئ تاريخي نازح تاريخي حالم تاريخي اسير ولع تاريخي استشهد تاريخي دموع لام طفله شهور بس مهدد مقاس شعوب عنهم شلل الشعب ومن رأى خطاب لقائد عن سلام يعني مجزرة تغيير دولي للخطاب صارت مقبرة حريتي على الهامش بتمناها مش على الهامش تنحط بآمن بالعدالة وفي شعوب معاي بآمن بالسلام بالأمل اللي جاي بآمن بشعب اللي طالب كإنسان تقرير المصير ولتحرير وطن اسمه فلسطين منش واحد وهم بحداي يجي وحداكم
Palestinian unit, hand to hand. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Maté.
Well, as the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq is marked around the world today, President Obama is heading to the Middle East. He'll be visiting Israel, making the first trip there of his presidency. Obama's three-day tour also includes stops in the occupied West Bank on Thursday and in Jordan on Friday. After brief tensions at the outset of Obama's first term, the Israeli government is seizing the opportunity to celebrate its improved relations with Obama. Israel has given Obama's trip its own branding, dubbing it Operation Unbreakable Alliance. A specially designed logo for the trip shows the Israeli and U.S. flags merging into one.
President Obama visits the West Bank, meanwhile, at a time of renewed protests against the Israeli occupation. The plight of the thousands of Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons has recently prompted demonstrations across the West Bank. Residents of villages and towns across the West Bank have also continued their nonviolent acts of civil disobedience as they seek to stop Israeli settlements from taking more of their land. Obama will not be visiting Gaza, which continues to languish under an Israeli blockade and recover from the most recent Israeli assault in November. The White House has taken pains to play down expectations, billing Obama's trip a listening tour. Obama supporters say the mission reflects the reality of the Middle East conflict, with the U.S. unable to forcefully change an intractable dispute. Speaking on MSNBC, former White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs said the onus is on Israelis and Palestinians to make peace.
The process is always aided and helped when we are involved in it, but we cannot construct Middle East peace for the Israelis and the Palestinians. We can help the process, we can foster that dialogue, but as Eugene said, people have seen the maps for 20 years, right? We know exactly where the borders would be. We know what has to happen within each of these two territories to make it happen. It is a political will on each side to make it happen.
That's former White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs speaking on MSNBC. Well, our next guest argues the U.S. could, in fact, play a decisive role in achieving Middle East peace if it simply reversed decades of policy backing the Israeli occupation. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University's Department of History and the author of a number of books. His newest, just out, Brokers of Deceit: How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East. He also just did an op-ed piece in the New York Times called Is Any Hope Left for Mideast Peace? Professor Khalidi, welcome to Democracy Now! What should Obama do in Israel and the occupied territories?
Well, what he should do is probably what he won't do, which is to reverse, as you suggested, several decades of policy. The approach that's been followed until now has failed comprehensively. It was never designed to achieve independent Palestinian statehood. It was never designed to end the occupation. I try and show in the book that it really was designed, of all people, by Menachem Begin, to make permanent Israeli control over the occupied territories, and that is what it has succeeded in doing up till now. So I think what the president should do is lay down a couple of markers. The United States is fundamentally opposed to occupation, which has to be ended, and the United States is fundamentally opposed to the absorption of territory into Israel through this settlement process. I don't think that by and of itself that will solve the problem, but at least it would separate the United States from Israel and would make it clear that we will no longer bankroll policies that have, in my view, already made a two-state solution virtually impossible, and that have created obstacles that will be almost impossible to overcome in the short term.
I'm curious to hear your response to Robert Gibbs. We just played a clip of him basically saying the conflict is intractable. The U.S. can only do so much.
Well, the U.S. could do a lot more than it's doing. What it has done up till now, in my view, certainly for the past 35 years, is to exacerbate the conflict, to make it much worse, by, in effect, supporting an Israeli position which really wasn't directed at ending the conflict or at ending the occupation or at stopping settlement. By supporting that in a variety of ways, we have made this thing infinitely more intractable. So, yes, the United States could play a role, but it has played a very negative role up till now.
Speaking on Democracy Now! In 2006, former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami said Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin never expected Oslo would result in the creation of a Palestinian state.
Arafat in Oslo reached an agreement that didn't even mention the right of self-determination for the Palestinians, doesn't even mention the need of the Israelis to put an end to settlements. If the Israelis, after Oslo, continued expansion of settlements, they were violating the spirit of Oslo, not the letter of Oslo. There's nothing in the Oslo agreement that says that Israelis cannot build settlements. It was an exercise in make-believe. The Palestinians didn't even mention self-determination, so a leader like Rabin could have thought that, okay, we will have an agreement that will create something which is a state minus. This was Rabin's expression. He never thought this will end in a full-fledged Palestinian state.
That's former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami speaking on Democracy Now! In 2006. Professor, I'm wondering if you could respond to what he said and also talk about your experience. You were an advisor to Palestinian negotiators before the Oslo deal was made.
Correct. Shlomo Ben-Ami is completely right. Unfortunately, the people who negotiated Oslo from the Palestinian side didn't take advantage of the experiences and lessons that we had gone through in Washington for 2 years, and did negotiate an agreement which did not lead to statehood. In fact, as he said in the clip that you just played, there was nothing in there about recognition of the Palestinian right to statehood or self-determination, which is one of many, many flaws in this agreement. This is why I said to Amy a minute ago, this was not a deal, this is not a structure that was designed to lead to a resolution of the conflict. This is actually conflict maintenance, at best, that the United States is engaged in. And you can blame the Israelis, but I think we should blame our own government for going along with this charade. This is a travesty. This is a grotesque Orwellian process. They use the word peace process. There is no peace. You've been at it for 35 years and you haven't produced peace, and you still talk about peace. Say this is a process in which the United States will, do a Monty game in front of people. But don't pretend that it's a peace process.
President Obama, what did he represent before he became president? What were his views? And you knew him in Chicago. You were both at the University of Chicago. He's a state senator from there before senator. And what he represents today.
Well, when I left Chicago in 2003, he was still a state senator, had not yet announced even for U.S. Senate. So his publicly expressed views, with the exception of one speech he gave opposing the Iraq War just before it started, his publicly expressed views, at least, had nothing to do with the Middle East. And even privately, he was not someone who was expansive on the subject. He listened. There were various conversations. This is a man who is worldly, knew something about the world, very intelligent. And I had the sense that he had some kind of understanding of things. But he was a politician with eyes on higher office, and he understood perfectly well what the political terrain in Chicago and Illinois and the United States was. And so long after I ceased to see him, say after we left Chicago, it was very clear that he was an extraordinarily careful politician in not stepping on the various landmines that would have absolutely prevented his reaching higher office. So I had very low expectations, and I think those expectations have been fully realized, unfortunately.
Well, a key moment for you in the book comes in September 2011 when President Obama goes to the UN and delivers a speech that focuses on his rejection of the Palestinian effort for statehood recognition. In his remarks, President Obama claimed to support a Palestinian state, even as he sought to convince international diplomats to reject one.
We seek a future where Palestinians live in a sovereign state of their own, with no limit to what they can achieve. And there's no question that the Palestinians have seen that vision delayed for too long. It is precisely because we believe so strongly in the aspirations of the Palestinian people that America has invested so much time and so much effort in the building of a Palestinian state and the negotiations that can deliver a Palestinian state.
President Obama went on to suggest that refusing to recognize Palestinian rights is justified because of Israel's security needs. In a glaring omission, Obama made no mention of Palestinian security, nor of Israeli torture and killings of tens of thousands of people in the occupied territories and Lebanon.
America's commitment to Israel's security is unshakable. Our friendship with Israel is deep and enduring. And so we believe that any lasting peace must acknowledge the very real security concerns that Israel faces every single day. Let us be honest with ourselves. Israel is surrounded by neighbors that have waged repeated wars against it. Israel's citizens have been killed by rockets fired at their houses and suicide bombs on their buses.
That's President Obama speaking in September 2011. Professor Colity.
Well, I think you could hear in that speech a repetition of some of the traditional tropes of the Israeli narrative of victimization. And if you start from there, that Israel is the country that needs security, Palestinian security is never mentioned. If you start from the idea that this is a country that represents the latest in a long line of persecution of the Jews going back into history from the Holocaust all the way back through the Inquisition and so forth, which the president actually, unfortunately, has done in many, many of his speeches. I mean, one of the things I go through in the book is the difference between expectations of President Obama and what he has actually said on this topic. And that's a perfect example of it. The Palestinians are people who have lived either expelled from their homeland under authoritarian Arab governments or under occupation for the entirety of the past 60 years, and nobody talks about their security. Of course the Israelis need security, but the expansive nature of that term in the Israeli lexicon includes things like keeping poor villagers in the southern part of the West Bank from getting water. That would threaten Israeli security. It includes preventing pasta from getting into the Gaza Strip. I mean, those are the kinds of things that are done in the name of security, because this term is so expansive in the Israeli-American lexicon. So starting from that point, you're not going to get to a resolution. If the United States continues to adopt this one-sided Israeli narrative, which it has under several presidents, I don't just fault this president. I talk about President Carter, President Bush Sr., and so forth. You're not going to get to a resolution. You're going to get where you are, a pro-Israel position that leads to further consecration of a very, very bad status quo.
You argued for a two-state solution for years. You say it is almost impossible now. Why?
Because for decades, Israeli planners have systematically acted in ways to make a state impossible by building settlements in regions that make it impossible to create a contiguous, viable Palestinian state. The settlement of Ariel, the settlement of Ma'ale Adumim, these are designed to cut the West Bank into strips such that Israel controls most of it if these so-called settlement blocks stay where they are. And we are bankrolling this. We give Israel $3 billion with which it defends its occupation. I mean, these were weapons supposedly used for self-defense, but defending an illegal occupation is not self-defense, and a lot of those weapons are used for that purpose. And through 501c3 so-called charities, which funnel money to extremist, violent, radical, racist settlers in the occupied territories, our tax dollars, in effect, are being used to subsidize the very settlements themselves. So all of this has created a reality which, I mean, Tony Judd once said, what any politician has done, another politician can undo. Any one of our politicians could stop those policies. Any Israeli politician could start to reverse that process. I just don't see that happening. That's why I say it's virtually impossible. We're stuck, in effect, with a one-state outcome right now. There's one state between the Mediterranean and the sea. Sorry, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River.
So what should people who want peace be pushing for then here in the U.S.?
we should be pushing for a change in our country's policies. Okay? You can't force the Israelis to do anything at this stage. You can't force the Palestinians to do anything either. But what you can do is change your own policies. I mean, are our weapons being used for self-defense? That's $3 billion a year of our weapons. $115 billion in aid have gone to Israel, most of it since 1973. That's the most any country has gotten. Don't we have the obligation to investigate how that money is being used, for what purposes? The second thing we can do is to see to it that tax dollars that are going to these so-called charitable organizations are in fact going to charities. I mean, if it's going to a hospital in Tel Aviv, fine. If it's going to the occupied territories, I don't understand why the IRS and the Treasury Department aren't cracking down on that the way they're cracking down on other things. So I think there are many things we as citizens can do to ensure that the United States is no longer the enabler and the bankroller of policies that most Americans, and for that matter, most Israelis, actually find reprehensible.
And can you talk about President Obama's actual trip, who he will be meeting with and where?
He's apparently, I mean, this is a trip to Israel with a side trip to Jordan and the occupied territories. He's in Israel, he's going to be meeting with all and sundry. He'll be meeting, of course, with the new government. In the occupied territories, apparently he's going to meet with President Abbas in Ramallah, and he'll be paying a visit to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and I believe he'll be meeting King Abdullah in Amman.
The issue of the split between Fatah and Hamas, to what extent do you think Palestinians can actually have any effect over resolving the conflict, or are they just powerless? But if they can have an effect, how big of an obstacle is this split?
It's a huge obstacle, and it's a terrible, divisive issue, and this is the Palestinians' fault. I mean, you can blame the United States or Israel until the cows come home for exacerbating the split, but you can't blame them for the split. This is the Palestinians' responsibility. And until this split is healed, and in fact, until the policies that both of these groups, in my view, represent, which are bankrupt, are changed, the Palestinians have no hope of changing their situation, and that's down to them. That's up to the Palestinians. And there's enormous dissatisfaction with the policies of the PA in Ramallah. There's enormous dissatisfaction in Gaza with the Hamas government, and public opinion really is very much against them. The problem is these are people strongly supported from outside and who have vested interests in the status quo, whether they're sitting in luxury in Ramallah or whether they're enjoying the perks of government in Gaza. So this is a Palestinian responsibility, and without changing these realities, the Palestinians are not going to be able to get off square one.
Your latest book, Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, is about the occupied territories, about Israel-Palestine. But on this 10th anniversary of the Iraq War, you've written extensively about Iraq as well. What are the effects? What have we seen in the Middle East?
Well, I think your reports earlier today did a really good job of talking about the impact on Iraq. The effect on the Middle East has really been quite terrible. Iraq is the second of three Middle Eastern countries that's been devastated by civil war and external intervention. Lebanon was the first. It went through 15 years of hell. Iraq was the second. It has been through 10 years of hell, which are not over. And the sectarian system that was installed, Gerard is completely right, by the United States, by Paul Bremer, is like injecting more poison into an already bad situation. We have put in a confessional system, I think probably based on that of Lebanon, which produced 3 civil wars in 100-odd years in Lebanon, into Iraq. So that effect has had all kinds of ripples in the region, increasing an already fraught sectarian situation. And what we're now seeing in Syria, sadly, is a third Arab country devastated by civil war. And this doesn't just mean the terrible human costs. It means destroying infrastructures of government. It means breaking down a rule of law. It means breaking down habits that have taken literally generations, well back into the Ottoman period, to create of governance and so forth. You know, you can talk about how bad the Syrian regime was, or the Iraqi regime, or the Lebanese confessional system, but there were some good things in the structures of government that were completely devastated in Iraq. So we're now seeing, sadly, a third Arab country, in the case of Syria, destroyed by civil war and external intervention, because like Iraq and like Lebanon, it's a proxy war. It's not just a civil war.
Finally, in Brokers of Deceit, you refer to the U.S. as Israel's lawyer.
Right. Well, I'm quoting Aaron David Miller, who's talking about himself and his fellow American diplomats, who in fact were not doing the job that they were supposed to do nominally, which was to be, disinterested mediators, but instead were shilling for Israel, in effect. And he, in turn, Miller, in his book, and in an article he wrote with that title, was quoting Henry Kissinger. So this is not my description. This is Henry Kissinger and Aaron David Miller's description, and I heartily endorse it.
Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University's Department of History and the author of several books. His latest, just out, Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East. We'll continue our conversation post-show, and we'll post online at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Dina Guzder, Aaron Mate. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate for another edition of Democracy Now!